Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Director of Public Services here at the Pratt. This evening, we are honored to have author Dr. Keisha Blain and moderator Dr. Martha Jones. Dr. Keisha Blain is a writer and scholar of America and African American history. She is Professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University, and she is a Guggenheim, Carnegie, and New America Fellow. She was a finalist of the National Book Critics Circle Award for her work, Until I Am Free. She is one of the most innovative and influential young historians of her generation of the 20th century United States, with interests and specializations in African American history, the modern African diaspora, and women's and gender studies. A former columnist for MSNBC, she is now the editor-in-chief of Global Black Thought. This evening's moderator, Dr. Martha Jones, writer, historian, legal scholar, and public intellectual, is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. A prize-winning author and editor of 5 books, most recently, The Trouble of Color. She is past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and has contributed to the New York Times, Atlantic, and many other publications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keisha Blain, who will be in conversation with moderator Dr. Martha Jones, discussing her latest work, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights.
Well, good evening. Good evening, folks here. Good evening to folks online. I'm Martha Jones, and it's my pleasure and my honor to be here this evening in conversation with Dr. Keisha Blain. Welcome back to Baltimore, Dr. Blain.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk to you about Without Fear. Maybe, could I ask you about the title to start? And
Yes.
Maybe that could lead into just offering folks an overview of the book, but I feel like when I say the title out loud, it feels so remarkably apt for this moment.
Yes, I think so. So this actually comes from a quote from Mary McLeod Bethune, who I think everyone has certainly heard of, just a remarkable Black woman, African-American educator, who in 1944 was leading a workshop, and she was speaking to a group of Black women. And essentially, she was telling them that it was important to do the work. She was emphasizing the significance of human rights advocacy, emphasizing the significance of forging transnational alliances. And she said to them, we can do this, and we must do it without fear and hesitancy. And I just thought that the quote beautifully captures, I think, the essence of this book and the message of this book. It truly is a reminder that the work that these women were doing, not only is it important to remember that they were doing difficult work, but they were doing the kind of work that essentially placed them at risk at a time where it was truly dangerous, and I think it still is in many ways dangerous to be at the forefront of these conversations. And so without even meaning to, it turns out that the title speaks to not only the past, but to the present.
One of the things I know about you is that you've been at this work for a good time now, which is to say, a lot of us came to your work early on, and with your focus on Black women's internationalism, but this pointed look at human rights is new. And so could you talk a little bit about how you get from internationalism to the very sharp edge, which is human rights?
Yes, I started thinking about this book and actually started writing it in earnest as I was in the process of finishing up my last book on Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think that's important to note because I think when it comes to Hamer's story, she was, as all of you know, such a powerful civil rights activist. We certainly know her in the context of the struggle for voting rights in this country. And the book that I wrote, Until I Am Free, grapples with not only her life, but really her legacy. I think about the way that, or I certainly talk about the way that her ideas remain relevant in the contemporary moment. That was really the driving force behind that book. But as I was writing that book, I spent some time thinking about Hamer as a global thinker, Hamer as someone we might situate far beyond the context of the civil rights movement. I discuss in that book how Hamer traveled to Guinea in 1964 and how that trip ultimately expanded her political consciousness. I think it helped her see the connections between what was happening in the US and what was happening on the African continent. We see that in her speeches following her travels. We see the way that she's connecting, for example, Mississippi and the Congo. And all of that is to say that Hamer's story, I think, pushed me toward this project, and particularly a quote that really stayed with me. She said at one point, "I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm fighting for human rights." And I started to grapple with that. What does she mean exactly? Why is she framing it this way? And I think the question in and of itself led me not only to more of Hamer's words on the subject, but to other Black women's ideas around rights, grappling with the difference between civil and human, because essentially that's what Hamer was saying. She was saying that she was sort of shifting her focus from the nation more so to thinking about fundamental rights that are guaranteed to all, regardless of one's citizenship status. So Without Fear, I think, comes from that particular context. And I will say, too, that what's remarkable about the book is that I was able to return to some of the women who I met while I was in the process of writing my very first book, Set the World on Fire, which, as you all know, is based on my doctoral dissertation. As I was writing Set the World on Fire, I discovered Pearl Sherrod, who I ended up talking about in earnest in this book. Shortly after I had published the first book, I learned about Marguerite Cartwright, and I've been thinking about her for about now at least 7 years, and wanted to say more about her story. And so it is both, I think, coming out of the context of the last book, but in many ways it represents just a thread that connects all of my work. Deeply interested in internationalism, to your point, and also interested in Black women's ideas. I'm interested in intellectual history. I'm interested in grappling with the way that they saw the world and how they tried to make sense of the world and the kinds of strategies and tactics they employed to make the world a better place. And I think all of these themes came together beautifully in this new book.
You know, your section on Mrs. Hamer really had a lot of surprises for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I have written about Fannie Lou Hamer as a civil rights and voting rights activist, but you open up this chapter that I think for me and perhaps for a lot of us was one that we really hadn't known. So there's one surprise for me, but I'll tell you the other surprise is that you begin this book not in the 20th century, right? Not in the modern civil rights era at all. You begin this book in the first decades of the 19th century. And so I guess I want you to talk about that, but what's really driving my question is that, you know, historians have spilled a lot of ink debating the history of human rights. some of them have insisted human rights really is a concept of the 20th century. And so my sense is that by focusing your lens on Black women, you learned something new about the long story of human rights, and one that takes us back quite a ways.
Absolutely. And I think that's just one of the remarkable things about writing a book is having a sense of what you want to accomplish, what you think you're going to write, and then learning in the process that you have to move in different directions. So to your point, absolutely, the way that I've understood human rights through a number of very influential texts is very much a 20th century concept. Some will argue that it's a story about the 1940s onwards. Others would say maybe 1970s onward. And I certainly knew that I would need to grapple with the 20th century. I knew that it would figure prominently in this book. But I also wanted these women's voices, I wanted their experiences to guide me. And so I initially started writing about Ida B. Wells in the context of the 19th century. And as I was writing about Wells, I realized I needed to take a step back further to talk about Mariah Stewart in the 1830s in order to show this long history and genealogy, essentially, of Black women's thinking about human rights, and to demonstrate that if we focus on Black women, we ultimately alter this entire framework that many historians have held up. Because no surprise, I noticed very quickly that the historians who do talk about human rights as being a 20th century phenomena, well, what's the evidence? Well, they're focused on human rights law, they're focused on the United Nations, they're focused on a number of very important developments, to be sure, but one, they're not talking about Black women. They're not talking about movements at the grassroots. They're thinking about human rights in a very top-down kind of narrative. And when you look at human rights from the bottom up, the entire narrative shifts. And part of that shift is, in fact, the timeline. And so the book became a way for me to push back against these narratives and say, well, maybe we can certainly talk about the United Nations. We can certainly talk about Amnesty International. We can talk about all of these very important institutions, and we can weave in the stories of diplomats and others. But in fact, if we start with Mariah Stewart in the 1830s, if we start with this remarkable early Black feminist who's thinking about these ideas at a moment when millions of Black people are enslaved in the United States. If we start there, we realize that in fact the story is quite different. And we realize that what we have identified as somehow novel in this longer history is in fact not new. And I tease that out in the book. I show how in 1919, for example, someone like Mary Church Terrell, she's articulating ideas that ultimately show up in so many ways in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that is to say that these Black women who are not generally who are not generally the center of these mainstream narratives do shape these narratives, and they shape these narratives in fundamental ways. And all I needed to do was to essentially bring these stories to the surface and shine the light on them. And I think in doing so, we understand that now the history is far more nuanced than we thought it was.
Can you say a little bit more about someone like Mariah Stewart? Because I mean, I think one of the myths that sometimes is told about Black history is that we can't, and particularly Black women's history, that there are no sources, there's no place to go. So how do you go about recovering the thought, the ideas, the human rights perspective that a Black woman in Boston in the 1820s and 1830s is bringing?
Well, I have to say, when it comes to Mariah Stewart as just one example, there is indeed a rich historical record, and for Stewart, a combination of things. We know that she's speaking throughout. And to be clear, she does have a short, I talk about the fact that she has a fairly short public career for a range of reasons. And you could imagine too, the kinds of pushback that she faced, the challenges, the threats that she endured simply because she was speaking boldly about slavery, and she was challenging, to be clear, not only white people in the context, but in many ways also black men. And as a woman, at a time where, of course, patriarchal ideas were very much at the center of how society functioned then, as is the case today. But Mariah Stewart there is certainly a record. So I was able to go back to her writings. I was able to go back to both her writings and her speeches, which we have access to, thankfully. And that was an opportunity for me to essentially sit with her words. I spent a lot of time poring over her words, and this is true for many of the women in the book, because I wanted to read them with this new lens. I wanted to go back to someone like Ida B. Wells, for example, who I've read a ton of, and say, okay, what is Wells actually saying about human rights in the 19th century? So that was the question I asked myself. And then when I went back to read her words, I saw them in a new light. And so that's part of what was happening. I had read Mariah Stewart many times before, but now I was reading her differently because I knew what I was looking for. As I explained in the book in the introduction, clearly when scholars are talking about human rights, those who want to be very particular to say, well, the term will not actually show up in the everyday lexicon until maybe the 1940s and so on. So there are people who will say this. And yes, it's important to talk about that particular part of the story, but part of what I'm also doing here is saying, well, how do we grapple with human rights long before the term shows up? And that means I'm looking for core tenets, essentially. So that meant going to the text and saying, what is Mariah Stewart saying about natural rights? What is she saying about universal rights? What is she saying about equality? Asking these kinds of questions, and then being able to show that actually she has a lot to say about all three. And in fact, the evidence is there. And so, yes, it's always challenging to do research. I'm aware of this. And then, of course, there's also debates about the archive. I'm happy to talk more about that. I recognize the limitations of the archive, that I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I'm also of the mindset that they're actually, I think if we're willing to, well, one, we have to be intentional. So that's the one thing. We have to look for certain things. We have to tell ourselves that there is something to find. And I think when you approach research with that kind of perhaps optimism, so to speak, I think so many things happen. And I found that to be true. Even when I was, as we're talking, I'm thinking about just the process of writing my first book and telling my advisor at the time and other mentors, I said, I want to tell a history of Black internationalism through the lens of Black women and working class and working poor women, and getting the sort of puzzled looks like, well, how in the world are you going to do that? What evidence will you find? But I was so determined. I was running all over the place and asking questions of archivists, and some of them also looked at me in a puzzled way because they didn't think that I could find anything. But I found so much, and I ended up finding more than I thought I would find. I found so much I couldn't even use everything that I did find for the book, and I think that experience was an important one for me to have, because it just shows that when you are intentional, when you have a hunt, and you are determined to find these stories, you will. Of course, it was a lot of piecing together. It was difficult, but I ultimately learned through that process that the possibilities are endless. And so in a similar way, once I set out to find these women's stories, I ended up, I mentioned to someone earlier, I now have a ton of material that I couldn't even fit into this book. simply because I ran out of space. At a practical level, I had a word count to be attentive to. But it just shows that really the record is truly remarkable.
You know, when I think of Mariah Stewart in particular, I always want to mention a historian of a full generation before you and I, and that's Marilyn Richardson. And Marilyn Richardson goes through the early American newspapers, particularly the anti-slavery newspapers, to discover the writings and the speeches of Mariah Stewart. And she publishes it's a slim little book that I think for a very long time was like one of those Bibles on my shelf, you know, because it was the evidence that, as you say, if you went looking for this, if you went looking for Mariah Stewart and women like her, you would find them, and you would find enough to even publish a book of Stewart's writings. But you had to first ask the question,
Correct.
right? And then you had to be dogged about the research. So we've been talking about human rights, and I think I want to sort of ask you to just drill in a little bit to help us understand better what this concept is, what it comes to mean for Black women. And to my mind, we oftentimes think of the Black freedom struggle through concepts like freedom and liberation, equality. But one of the concepts that you really foreground for us, I think, is a term we don't hear invoked as often, and yet I know that it is at the core of human rights, and that is dignity. So can you talk a little bit about this concept of human rights, and as you suggested, right, how it is distinct from the kinds of civil and political rights that we most often associate with the Black freedom struggle?
Yes, and this is a term that shows up really so many times in this book, especially because I see it coming up in women's writings and women's speeches, this notion of human dignity. One of the things that I lay out, I think, in the book that's so important to grapple with is just that for many of the women who I'm writing about, it's not a question of the sort of the relationship between the individual and the nation state, or perhaps the relationship between the citizen and the federal government. And I'm not suggesting that these concerns don't matter clearly, especially understanding the context of slavery in the United States. Part of the goal with the end of slavery for formerly enslaved people is, in fact, to make the argument that they ought to be recognized as citizens of the United States, right? That they are part of the national polity. That is certainly an important argument to make. But to the notion of dignity, I think many of the women who I write about, they're taking, I think, one step further. They are concerned about the relationship between Black people and the state, and they recognize that there are certain demands they can make because of the promises of the Constitution. Certainly, they are clear about that. But they're also trying to make a case that Black people should be treated differently solely on the basis of their humanity. And so to this question of human dignity, it's a matter of how individuals not only should treat others, but how they expect others to treat them. It's a moral question, which is exactly why I think the theme of religion figures prominently in this book. All of the women are not religious. All of the women, I talk about women from diverse, with diverse religious perspectives. But at the core of this argument is a question of, well, how should I be treated? How should you be treated? And the way we should be treated really comes down to this notion of dignity, that we should be treated with respect simply because we are human. And to the religion and sort of the spiritual aspect of it, that many of these women were very clear that these were essentially God-given rights and protections. And to say that they were God-given, that they were divinely inspired, or even to say that human dignity as a concept is tied to this notion of divine inspiration, is to say that no man, no government certainly could take that away. And that's a powerful argument to make. It doesn't mean that everyone will necessarily agree with you. It doesn't mean you won't encounter resistance when you make the case. But to make the case, and to make it in the 1830s, and then to make it in the late 19th century, to make it at a time when Black people, when certainly Black women don't have full access to the vote, when Black women, as Black men, are largely shut out of many of these formal traditional halls of power, if you will. I think that in and of itself is such an important part of the story that I tell here, and I think that at the core of it is this question of dignity and human dignity, and it drives many of these women's, I think, political vision certainly, and it comes up over and over again. Mutual respect, human dignity, that's what we're asking for. It's not to say we don't want voting rights. We certainly want that. We want to be treated as citizens. We want to be acknowledged as citizens of the United States, but it's more than that. You need to treat us as human.
Yes. So I promised you that there were some women in this book I hoped we would bring into the room a little bit tonight. And I must start with a native Baltimorean, because Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, born here in 1825, we are celebrating Harper's 200th birthday this year here in Baltimore, but in many, many places. But she figures in your story. And some of us may know Harper as the prolific poet that she was, as the courageous abolitionist that she was, as the firebrand suffragist that she was, as the novelist she became, and more. But you set her early on in this story as also one of the crafters of this human rights vision. So we're thrilled to discover Frances Harper in this epic tale that you've told. But tell us a little bit about her, if you would.
Yes, and I will say too, that talking about her and thinking about her pairs nicely with another person from Baltimore, or at least Baltimore County, which is Amanda Berry Smith, who shows up in the book too. And one of the reasons that I evoke both women is once again, I'm trying to demonstrate how these concepts, these ideas about human rights, they're not secondary. They really are front and center in these women's, I think, certainly in their political vision, in the way that they are framing their arguments, even as we talk about Harper as an abolitionist or an early feminist. I thought it was important to show through her own writings and speeches how she was also thinking globally, which is interesting. We should sort of know that, but I think that the way that we've certainly discussed her has not often reflected on that, and so I tried to emphasize it, as I do with Amanda Berry Smith, who's similar but also different. And this is a missionary who's traveling throughout the African continent. She's traveling widely, and much of the conversation, I think, within the scholarship has been about her as a missionary who's sharing the gospel, and that is certainly happening. But I spend time with her sermons to show, well, she was also talking about human rights, and she was talking about the importance of really connecting, drawing inspiration from the Bible to make these claims. And I think in a similar way, Frances Harper was doing so. And the other thing too, which I want to emphasize a bit, since I didn't say it earlier, is it's not just that these women were talking about these concerns or grappling with these ideas, but it was also the fact that they were essentially taking these concepts and making these concepts their own. What do I mean? Well, I talk about in the early sections of the book, I grapple a lot with this notion of the rights of man. So just briefly, 1791, this is a political pamphlet that essentially defends the French Revolution. It's one of the core texts that we often reference in thinking about the development of human rights as a concept, certainly, among many. But once again, we're talking about a text that's coming from a white political thinker, a white man who, as I explained, is not thinking about people of African descent, right, in the calculation. Certainly not imagining that someone like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper or someone like Amanda Smith Berry or Mariah Stewart or any of these individuals would grab a hold of the concept and say, but we too are part of this vision. You may not acknowledge it, you may not see it, but we see that we are part of this vision, and we're going to take the concept that effectively excludes us, and we're making it our own. We're drawing on our own experiences as Black women, grappling with racism, grappling with sexism, grappling with a number of different kinds of oppression that are overlapping in the historical context. We're going to then take that and use it as fuel for our activism at the local level, at the national level, and at the global, right, and the international level. So that's also what I'm doing in this book is really taking what I think has been framed as a kind of white European, concept, so to speak, and saying that, well, actually, here are people left out of the calculation who insert themselves, and they do so powerfully through their writings and speeches and through an array of organizations. And certainly, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper fits into that narrative, as do Amanda Smith Berry.
You know, I can't help but remind folks, I think, of probably Harper's most often quoted line, right? We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And when I repeat those words today, I think, boy, Harper really set the bar high, because we might not feel every day like we are all bound up together. Some of us are bound to one another, and others not so much. She really, but she really understood something about the kind of ambitious vision that you're describing, and indeed, she leaves a legacy, right, for us that I think is challenging in our own moment. So I'm very fortunate to have the microphone, so I get to ask about the women that are fascinating to me still, and another of them is Mary McLeod Bethune.
Right.
You know, Mrs. Bethune, right, the educator, the club organizer, the suffragist, the member of the president's kitchen cabinet, on and on, as an extraordinary life. And she is someone who has received, I think, generous scholarly treatment. Your colleague, Noliwe Rooks, just recently published a book about the thought of Mary McLeod Bethune. I guess I want to ask you partly how she fits into this story, but because she's someone who indeed lives into the 1950s, right, into that moment that so many scholars of human rights have pointed to, right, as the origin story. Why do we miss Mrs. Bethune? I want to say one more thing about Mrs. Bethune. To me, writing about Mrs. Bethune was confounding. You know, she was, she knew she was going to be, she knew we would be here talking about her, right? She knew she was going to be the subject of political and historical inquiry for a long time to come. So sometimes she started to penetrate. But I want to ask the flip version of that, which is, how does she get, I think, so underappreciated and overlooked? I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I that's my sense, right, is that she doesn't make it into these even standard accounts of human rights in the 40s and 50s in the 20th century.
Correct, and I found that to be true. I would say, in fact, as I was finishing up the Hamer book and starting to work on this one, I was physically located at the CAR, now called the Carr Ryan Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I was there, which was important to be in dialogue with human rights practitioners and others, and was struck by the fact that a lot of people I spoke to about the work I was doing did not know about Bethune. I remember thinking, well, if you know anything about the United Nations, you have to know Bethune. Turns out a lot of people didn't.
Make sure you tell us
Yes,
that. Yeah.
yes, because so it's actually interesting because I just recently saw a clip. So Bethune was one of 3 African Americans who were delegates at the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. So she, along with W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White, collectively representing the NAACP. It's important then to note that she was the only Black woman. What's interesting, I saw a clip recently of Bethune. I was talking to a documentarian, so they were sharing with me these clips from 45, and they showed me a clip of Bethune in San Francisco. She was on her way to the meeting, and she was signing autographs in the street. And I remember thinking, what? She was that big of a deal, right, at the time, and essentially a celebrity, right? But it made sense. Right? She'd been working closely with Eleanor Roosevelt, as an example, really prominent figure. You know, I mentioned earlier about just emphasizing the history and how many of these women were not, in the room, so to speak. Bethune was in the room, right? I mean, she was absolutely in the room. She had access in very important ways. It didn't mean that she didn't face challenges, but she certainly had access, and she could push to influence conversations. And she did, never shied away from the opportunity to do so. And she was very invested, and I talk about her as an internationalist. She's someone was always thinking at multiple levels, so not just grappling with the national context, but the global context. She encouraged Black women to travel broadly. So such a remarkable figure. The fact that she would play such a key role in helping to draft the Charter of the United Nations, and that in and of itself does not seem to be widely known, that's troubling. Why that's the case, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, of course, it's, I do wonder if part of it has to do with the way that the scholarship has presented her. She's oftentimes presented in ways that are not as favorable, and I also wonder about the class dimensions here. I think there are ways in which she has been maybe not pushed out, but perhaps not as emphasized in a narrative because of her background. You know, these are questions, these are things that I wonder about. What I will say is that I make sure that I certainly try to give her due in this book. And I think it's important, and to your point, Professor Jones, because when scholars are talking about, well, you know, human rights is the story of the 1940s, right? They're saying so because of largely the establishment of the United Nations. How then do you acknowledge that without acknowledging the crucial role that Mary McLeod Bethune played? It's simply impossible. And part of what I'm saying is we need to make sure that we center her story. She, as I explained, encountered an array of challenges at the UN. So this is not, a neat story. She tried to advocate strongly to make sure that the charter would grapple with colonialism, as an example. A lot of her recommendations were not accepted for a range of reasons. But she still held her own, and she spoke out openly. She spoke out widely about not only the challenges she faced, but what she felt was important to be included in these conversations. And so I think she left such a remarkable legacy on which many women would build. And I talk about in the book Paulette Nardal, for example, who then becomes the first Black woman area expert, 1946, so just a year after, coming from Martinique, or at least she's from Martinique, travels to New York to do that work. So I think Bethune really opens the door in many ways for an array of Black women, both in the US context, but Black women globally, who contribute to the United Nations in the decades to follow.
You know, my recollection is, you'll tell me if I'm remembering right, was that neither Walter White nor W.E.B. Du Bois was very pleased to welcome Mrs. Bethune to
Correct.
that UN delegation. So
Didn't want to say it.
well, that's why I'm here. On the one hand, and on the other hand, she becomes immediately an ally and a collaborator with women of color from across the globe, right? You know, that there they are, they are all together, and they are building relationships and a point of view. And so I think she is so remarkable, I think, for revealing some of the inner workings of those scenes, right? That she really permits us to see vividly some of the very intrinsic challenges of building something like the United Nations. Okay, we have probably time for just a question or two from me, and then I'm going to open it up. So folks, I hope, are getting their questions ready, and there's a microphone here for that. So we'll turn to you in a minute. But I want to ask you about one last bit that, again, really was an eye-opener to me. And maybe I'll just say the word Asia. I'll just point to Asia, because that is not the story I thought you were going to tell us about Black women's internationalism and about their human rights vision, and how essential Asia is as a place, as a set of ideas, as a set of politics and opportunities and relationships and more. Please.
Yes, and so here I will admit I have a sort of unfinished manuscript on Black women's engagement with Japan in the 20th century. I started writing it before, before I think the COVID, but before the lockdown, and ended up pulling away from it because I couldn't travel as I needed to travel to pull it together. So one day I think I will manage to finish it. But I say that because I've just been thinking a lot about Japan in particular. I've just been intrigued with this idea of Afro-Asian solidarity through that particular lens. I've been interested in the question of why Black women are involved in these political movements, what drive them, especially leading up to World War II. What do they see in Japan? What do they think about imperialism? What do they think about Japan's imperialism? How do they rationalize what they see as a potential collaboration with Japan in order to defeat white supremacy? So these are questions that I ask, especially I'm also thinking through the kind of gender politics in these movements. So it's still in the back of my mind and something I may come back to. I mentioned that because, of course, as I'm writing this book, I saw an opportunity in which to grapple with some of this, so I absolutely took advantage. And when I say I saw the opportunity, as I was writing about Madam C.J. Walker, and I was writing about the fact that she is involved in this short-lived organization, ILDP, the International League for Darker People. So this is 1919. She's collaborating with an array of activists, Black socialists, Black nationalists, so someone like A. Philip Randolph, also Marcus Garvey, just to name a few. And one of the things that she's committed to doing is essentially forging this collaboration with a group of Japanese delegates who are on their way to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. So I talk about that, and I won't get into all the details in the interest of time, but once I opened up this story and I grappled with what it meant within the larger conversation of human rights, and as I talk about in the book, and we'll see, I think some scholars may quibble with me, but I frame the ILDP as a sort of early manifestation of a human rights organization. And as I said, some people may quibble with me, but I see the evidence there, and I grapple with the way that they are framing their arguments that seem to be clear to me that they are making a human rights case. And once I entered that conversation, I knew I needed to come back to the question of Japan, which I then do in a later chapter in the context of the 1930s, when there's a lot of organizing around Afro-Asian solidarity. So very interesting topic that emerges, but it's one way of just showing how Black women, and again, Black women at the grassroots, I talk about working class Black women, sometimes linked to the Nation of Islam as an example, are very much involved in internationalist politics, and Asia certainly broadly become one avenue through which they're pushing these ideas, and making a larger claim that it's not just a question of rights and liberation at the national level, but it is a question of a global dialogue. And clearly, by inserting Japan, it complicates the narrative in so many ways, but that's part of why I think, discussing it, because it shows us just the complexity of Black thought in the 20th century.
Well, it's one of the things, I mean, if I could put it this way, I think it's one of the things we've come to expect from you and to appreciate about you, which is to say, you're going to teach us things that were just, for me at least, sort of beyond my imagination. And it really is a book that is mind expanding in that way, in so many ways. So I want to encourage folks to come to the microphones. Our hosts are here. Superb. Thanks
Wonderful.
so much.
We have around 15 minutes for questions. So if you have a question and you'll come to the microphone I am currently yammering at, or the microphone on the other side of our auditorium where my compatriot is at.
We've got folks with questions.
Wonderful.
Terrific.
We're going to start with the person right behind me. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for your time this evening, both of you. I really appreciated your question that introduced the concept of dignity and humanity. And when I think about Black women's leadership in human rights, I think about the role that Black mothers play in reflecting the humanity and dignity back to their own children. For a lot of Black people, that's really where they experience it. And I first and most consistently. And I'm just curious, like in your research, was there a thread that you found related to Black motherhood, or just in general, Black women's role in the Black family and in the Black community as holders of the center as it relates to like Black people having dignity and needing to, or being, just having the right to being treated with dignity and respect?
Thank you for that. Absolutely. In fact, the last chapter of the book is a discussion of Khady Diallo, who's Amadou Diallo's mother. And I interviewed her. Let me step back and give context and not assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about. So this is 1999. Amadou Diallo, immigrant from Guinea, who had only been in New York City for a short time. He was standing outside of his apartment. A group of police officers spotted him, and they later said that he resembled a suspect they were looking for in a rape case. Nonetheless, it's not even clear that he had any exchange with them. They said they called out to him. He apparently didn't answer, and they said that he reached for something. They thought it was a gun, and they shot him. He was shot at 41 times. Of course, later, it's established that all he had was a wallet. So I remember this case, and even just talking about it now brings back so many emotions, because I was living in Brooklyn at the time, from the Caribbean, but I grew up in Brooklyn, and I was very young. But I remember just the pain. It stays with me to this day. So as I was in the process of writing this book, I was thinking a lot about how I would grapple with human rights in a more contemporary sense. And I thought, okay, I think this is a story that I want to tell. And I've reached out to Khady Diallo, and she agreed to speak to me. And so I gathered whatever I could collect, newspapers and archives, and and then sat with her, recorded conversations around this, and I was able to flesh out her story. But I bring her up because she's really a perfect example of this. She comes to the United States in 1999. She comes with one goal, essentially. She wants to find out what happens, if she wants to claim her son's body, she wants to take him back to Guinea to bury him. So she's coming for practical reasons, but it changes the whole trajectory of her life. And nothing is ever the same. And I talk about how she becomes a human rights activist, essentially, because of that painful experience. And it's through that, right? So to your question, she's talking about what has happened to him through that lens, right, of human dignity, and saying, this is not right. This is actually a human rights abuse. Part of having human rights is the ability to stand outside your apartment, minding your own business, not bothering anybody, and not having to be shot at 41 times, right? And it's something that is deeply personal for her. And as a mother, she's grappling with the grief of all of this. And what she does is she taps into a community in New York City. She's working with Al Sharpton, as an example. She's connecting to all of these activists who are making similar claims and who are trying to make changes, not only to laws in New York City, but really trying to grapple with state-sanctioned violence on a national scale, and connecting that to a global dialogue around human rights. So that's just one example of a mother, certainly the theme of motherhood, reinforcing these points, and I talk about many others in the book. Many other mothers show up in the book, and I won't, since I've already spent so much time, I won't emphasize other examples, but I do think that this is an important theme, and thank you for asking the question.
Hi, thank you, Ms. Blain, for being here today. My name is Rebecca Ofer, and I'm a student at the University of Baltimore, amateur historian. And in doing a lot of research about females, we realized that because what was chosen to be kept is usually from the male perspective, so then when things happen, like, oh, it's the first woman to do this, and it's really not the first woman, it's the first woman that we've known of. How do we change that for future generations? Instead of having them think that they have to be the first one to break through the glass ceiling, that it's already been broken, how do we spread the message wider that women have always been doing these things, they've always been working in the background, because we were not allowed in rooms, because they decided not to put our names on papers? How do we get that scholarship to be more accessible to the general public so that females, girls, understand that they have heroes already here, and they don't have to be the first one to do it, but they can take what was done and build from it?
And so your question is really hits to the heart of what guides me literally every day that I get up. I'm thinking about that. I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to teach at a university, and I'm certainly an academic, but I have always been deeply committed to breaking free from the four walls of the academy, quite frankly. And that is hard to do, and it also comes with a lot of challenges that I won't get into, but one can imagine just what a scholar like myself has to go through, because I'm just interested in having different kinds of conversations with different people. I'll put it that way. It's one of the reasons that I write the books that I write, but it's also one of the reasons why I write op-eds. It's one of the reasons why I'm always involved in an array of projects. I'm working with Smithsonian as an example. I'm interested in working with documentarians as an example. I'm also working with folks in public policy as an example. A lot of things that I do behind the scenes because I'm invested in getting these stories out to a range of different people. And at a personal level, and I've perhaps mentioned this in other ways, I'm a first generation college student. I didn't imagine I would become a historian, had never even met a historian by the time I had started college. And you know what, my parents did not have the opportunities that I have had. And I always said to myself that I never wanted to write anything that my mother couldn't understand. And I say that because it was important to me to produce work that's accessible. And I think I certainly strive to do that. So how do we get this out there? Well, through an array of methods, quite frankly. I mentioned just a few. We really do have to take the lead here, and we can't just simply rely on colleges or even classroom settings. And all of these spaces are important, to be sure, but so many people don't have access. And even beyond access, given the climate, a lot of these topics don't even make it into the classroom. So I think whatever we can do within our communities, I think that's going to be important, whether it is through religious groups, through churches as an example, political spaces, an array of community groups might be just the avenue through which to offer courses, for example, that expose students or expose members of the community to this kind of material. I think that's important to do. And I just think it's important to really work with others who are committed to doing that work. Because I want to resist against the kind of individualistic approach to, well, I have to do this, I have to, and granted, there's a lot you can do at the individual level, but really, I think tap into the networks of people who are like-minded and who want to get this information out there. And to your earlier point, I just want to say too, like, I've been thinking a lot about this, right, to the question of this notion that Black women aren't present or they're not doing this kind of work. I opened a chapter, in the 5th chapter of the book, I open with the 1958 gathering in Accra, Ghana. This is the All African Peoples Conference. And this is an important moment for Kwame Nkrumah and others who are talking about a path forward and thinking about the end of colonialism, certainly, which of course by 58 is true for Ghana, but not for every part of the African continent. But the point is that this is a moment that historians hold up, and they talk about all of the important conversations that are taking place. They don't talk about women. And in that chapter, I start with all the men and all the conversations and the strategizing, and then I introduce the person in the room who's taking notes. And it's Marguerite Cartwright, and no one's really paying attention to this woman, but then the chapter is telling you and showing you how she's literally shaping the conversation. And so it was an intentional move. You know, people say, well, why are you starting with the men? It's intentional that I started with the men having the conversation. I wanted you to see how even when people think we're not present, we are. And even when people think we're not shaping the conversations, we are. And I showed how she does so through her columns and her relationships and all of that. So I do think that part of it is getting these stories out into the world. And I think as a budding historian, you have an opportunity to do that. And so far beyond your dissertation and all of that, that's important. Be thinking about other spaces in which to share your work. Whether it's op-ed writing, whether it's podcasting, but think outside the box, right? People are going to say, oh, you won't get tenure. Listen, tenure is tenure. It is what it is, right? Get your work done, but make sure that you are deeply committed to getting these stories out into the broader world and make the time to do that. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
You've been too modest, right? Because one of the things about this book, right, is that it is the kind of book you can read, yes, in class, but in book group that can pass from mother to daughter. It's biographically driven, and so there are vivid, exciting characters in this book. And so I think it's the embodiment very much of your philosophy.
Thank you.
I know we have just a couple of minutes, so could we take the last 2 questions and then have Dr. Blain respond to them?
You read my mind, absolutely.
I read your mind. I love that. Yes.
2 more questions. We'll start with the individual right behind me.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out. My name is Ari. First off, everything you're saying, you say it so eloquently, and I really, really appreciate that. And you've been mentioning so many amazing women of our history. I grew up with a mother who loves, and I can't emphasize how much, loves history. So it's always kind of been put in my face, like so much so that she, instead of buying the fun books at the bookstore, she got me these stacks of scholastic books about Black men and women. So it's always kind of been in my face. And one thing I've always kind of been in front of is seeing these women and learning about myself, what I can do, what I'm capable of, what I can learn, what I can teach. And you mentioned a lot of these women, and specifically Fannie Lou Hamer, which we found out we're related to. She's like a cousin on my mom's side.
That's amazing.
But just learning about all these things, and I'm curious, when you finish this book, what is something that specifically Black women in this day can learn about themselves, or what do you hope that they can see in themselves once they finish reading?
So hold on to that. We're
Yeah.
going to get one more question, and then we'll let Dr. Blain have the last word.
All right, to a degree, it was kind of sort of answered a little bit. But how can everyday people, especially Black women, cultivate that same fearless spirit in their own work for justice?
Thank you so much. Great questions. Where to begin? Well, one of the things that I have reflected a lot about as I've been writing this book, and now that it's complete, is how powerful these ideas really are. One of the reasons that I love focusing on ideas, and as opposed to necessarily organizations or institutions, is that when we focus on organizations or institutions, oftentimes there is a sort of beginning and an end. There's a way in which we can talk about, perhaps the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and then we could say, well, this is the moment where everything fractured and Garvey's deported and the membership declines, and all of that is true. But if the question is less about the organization and the individual, but about the idea or ideas, what we see are just the ways that the story lives on, right, past the individual and far beyond the organization. I think a lot about that, because part of what you see in the book is just the way that Black women pick up the mantle. So I start with Ida B. Wells, and I'm telling you about the way that she's doing the work, and she's committed, and she's traveling, and she's meeting with President McKinley, and she's trying her best to make this argument about human rights. And yet her words fall on deaf ears. But if that's all the story that I was going to tell, then it would simply be, well, there you go. She tried, she failed, the end. But it's not that. It's how she pushes these ideas. People don't necessarily listen to her, but then another generation of women pick up the mantle. Some who know her directly, others who don't even know her directly, maybe never met her, but they're moved, they're inspired, and they push forward. And then another generation pushes it forward. I think that's important to reflect on in this moment, especially when a lot is happening where it seems like it's hard to imagine change in the moment, right? And I think a lot of these women were exactly at a place where we are right now, where they didn't necessarily see a clear path. But you don't just do the work because you see a clear path. You do it because you know you need to do it, right? To go back to what Mary McLeod Bethune said, you have to do it, and you have to do it without fear and hesitancy. And I think that is a lesson for all of us in this moment. It's not that things are necessarily going to change quickly tomorrow or the next day, but is that we are building on a legacy. These women laid the groundwork for us to keep pushing. And even though I said at the beginning of this conversation, human rights are God-given and divinely inspired, they're also not permanent, which is to say we can't just sit back and say, oh, good job, thank you, Ida B. Wells, you did it, so now we can rely. No, we have to keep fighting and keep doing that work. So I think the fuel to the fire is really paying attention to what these women did, to these women's stories. That I think is important to reflect on in this moment. And I do believe it gives us hope for the future. And I do believe that it's the kind of narrative we need today, the kinds of stories we need today to push back against all of the circumstances, the challenges that we're facing in this moment. So I hope that answers your question about the kind of fuel to the fire. And I also hope it answers your question too. Just thinking about Black women's legacies. So thank you all. Thank you.
Dr. Blain, thank you for adding fuel to our fire. And it's been an honor to have you here with us at the Pratt and in Baltimore. Join me in thanking Dr. Keisha Blain. And I know Dr. Blain is going to hang around and sign books, say hello to folks. So please join her outside.
The Ivy Bookshop is selling books this evening. They still have books. Please buy books. We'll be outside in a couple moments to continue talking about books and signing books. And thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you.
It was great.
Oh, thank you. It's really great conversation.